The roar of the Youngstown steel mill is loud enough to drown out a scream, but it can't silence the crinkle of the motel receipt hidden in Tara's pocket. As she stands on the edge of the casting floor, the air is a shimmering haze of sulfur and molten heat that singes the hair on her arms. Across the sea of glowing metal, her husband Sean moves through the sparks like a ghost, his eyes cold and defiant. He isn't just avoiding her gaze anymore. He's guarding a secret that is worth more than their crumbling house or her brother's failing life. Suddenly, a rhythmic metallic shriek tears through the industrial thunder, the sound of a high-pressure valve reaching its breaking point. A spray of white-hot scale erupts from the line, narrow-missing Tara's face, but she doesn't flinch. She's staring at the massive iron ladle overhead, which has begun to tilt at a sickening, impossible angle. In this suffocating heat, the line between a workplace accident and a cold-blooded choice is beginning to melt. And Tara realizes that the man holding the controls might be the same one who just signed their death warrant. Tara McConnell gripped the rubber straps of her safety goggles, pulling them tight until the thick material bit into the skin of her temples. The air inside the Youngstown mill didn't just move. It vibrated with a low-frequency roar that rattled the teeth in her jaw. Every breath tasted of sulfur and pulverized coal, a dry, caustic mixture that scorched the back of her throat. Before her, the conveyor groaned under the weight of glowing steel slabs. These massive orange monoliths radiated a heat so intense it felt like a physical weight, singing her eyebrows and making the sweat on her forehead evaporate before it could even bead. Tara raised the heavy control probe, her eyes narrowed against the shimmering haze of heat and metallic soot. Black flakes of carbon drifted through the air like a winter from hell, settling on her damp forearms and mixing with the industrial grease to form a dark sludge. She stepped closer to the line, ignoring the stinging spray of scale that jumped off the cooling metal. Her focus remained locked on a hairline fracture she'd spotted near the edge of a slab, even as the oxygen-starved air made her head swim. In the employee smoking area, a cramped space defined by concrete and chain link, the air hung thick with the blue haze of cheap tobacco and the smell of iron filings. Old Dick, a man whose lungs sounded like a shovel scraping gravel, spat a dark glob onto the floor and jerked his chin toward the silent silhouette of the No. 5 blast furnace in the distance. Tara leaned against a rusted pillar, watching the way the conversations died whenever a foreman walked within earshot. Frank, a mill veteran of 30 years, gripped a grease-stained wrench so tight his knuckles turned the color of bone. He muttered through gritted teeth about the lists being drawn up in the glass-walled offices of the management building. Tara saw a young apprentice nearby, her hands trembling as she tried to light a cigarette, her eyes wide with the terror of a child hearing ghost stories. The murmur of the crowd grew, a low tectonic grumble that threatened to drown out the mechanical shriek of the nearby rolling mills. Despite the radiant heat of the furnaces, a sharp chill traced a path down Tara's spine when the word mothballing finally rippled through the group. The front door of her house groaned on its hinges as Tara pushed her way inside, only to be hit by a cloying chemical scent that made her stomach turn. It was the smell of rot and artificial sweetness. Her brother, Jacob, lay sprawled on the sagging sofa, his head lolling back at an angle that looked broken. His pupils had retreated into tiny, pinprick dots of obsidian, leaving his eyes vacant and terrifying. Tara lunged forward, grabbing his shoulders and shaking him with a desperate, frantic strength. But his limbs remained limp, possessing the weight of wet rope. On the coffee table, nestled among half-empty beer cans and cigarette ash, sat a discarded plastic blister pack. Tara's breath came in ragged hitches as she turned her pockets inside out, fishing for the crumpled bills she'd hidden away for the mortgage. Her fingers shook as she counted the meager pile of singles and change, staring at Jacob's translucent, waxy skin. She realized with a sinking dread that this pittance would barely cover the cost of a basic detox kit from the pharmacy, let alone the real help he needed. Sean didn't cross the threshold until the kitchen clock had ticked past midnight. Tara sat at the table, her hands flat against a stack of unopened bills that seemed to glow under the fluorescent light. Sean moved with a deliberate, heavy-footed avoidance, refusing to meet her eyes as he yanked at the laces of his work boots. He kicked them into the corner with a dull thud that echoed through the small house. When Tara slid the notebook filled with their monthly expenses toward him, the legs of his chair shrieked against the linoleum. His face was a mask of chiseled indifference, a wall she couldn't scale. To her question about the overtime he'd promised, he offered only the sharp, aggressive slam of the refrigerator door. Tara watched a vein throb in his neck, a rhythmic ticking of suppressed rage. Without a word, he turned his back on her and retreated toward the bedroom, leaving behind a wake of scent that wasn't grease or smoke, but a floral, expensive perfume that didn't belong to her. The next morning, Tara reached for Sean's work jacket to toss it into the laundry pile and felt a stiff, sharp square of paper hidden in the lining. She reached into the side pocket and pulled out a scrap of gray thermal paper, translucent with oil stains. Her eyes locked onto the logo of the Roadside Paradise Motel, a place known for hourly rates and flickering neon, situated just past the city limits. The date printed on the receipt was a direct hit. The same night Sean claimed he was pulling an emergency shift to fix a ruptured valve in the third shop. Tara traced the jagged, perforated edge of the slip with her thumb, the paper feeling like a razor against her skin. Her heart skipped, a sickening lurch against her ribs as she stared at the total. It was an amount that could have kept the refrigerator full for an entire week, now spent on a room she'd never seen. Tara's hand curled into a fist, crushing the receipt into her palm before shoving it deep into the pocket of her jeans. She walked into the bedroom where Sean lay staring at the ceiling, his body rigid. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs groaning under her weight. She placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to force him to look at her, her voice a low, controlled tremor as she asked where their savings were going. Sean didn't just move. He exploded, shucking her hand off like a bothersome insect and bolting upright. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He didn't answer. He roared, accusing her of being a paranoid nag, of suffocating him with her constant whining about money and bills. Tara watched his nostrils flare, a predator's reflex, before he lunged off the bed and stormed out. The bathroom door slammed with a force that rattled the pictures on the walls, leaving her in a silence that offered no truth, only more questions. The rusted hinge of the mailbox screamed as Tara pulled out the morning's haul. On top of the pile sat an envelope with a bold, crimson stamp that screamed delinquent. It was a final notice for the electricity. Tara's eyes blurred as she scanned the total, the numbers swimming like insects on the page. She felt a numbness creep into her fingertips, a cold that started in her marrow. She looked up at the windows of her house, the peeling paint and the sagging porch. Somewhere behind those curtains was a brother who was dying in slow motion, and a husband who had already checked out. She realized with a terrifying clarity that without Sean's next paycheck, they would be sitting in the dark, waiting for the sheriff to arrive. The papers in her hand shook, a frantic rustle in the wind, as she pressed them against her chest. The only way out led back through the gates of the mill, back into the soot and the noise that was slowly killing them all. Tara walked into the women's locker room 30 minutes before the morning whistle, trying to blend into the shadows. At the far end, near the rusted lockers, a group of women huddled together, their voices dropping into a sharp, jagged silence the moment she appeared. Betty and Linda exchanged a quick, knowing look before breaking into thin, cruel smirks, turning back to the cracked mirrors to adjust their hair. Tara felt the weight of their gaze, a mixture of pity and mockery. Linda whispered something just loud enough to carry, words about young waitresses and husbands with wandering eyes. The metallic clang of locker doors closing sounded like a firing squad in the small room. Tara's cheeks burned with a sudden, fierce heat as she pulled on her heavy work robe, feeling the invisible weight of their judgment. They were writing the obituary for her marriage right there, among the smell of industrial soap and old sweat. By mid-morning, Tara stood at the control station, her eyes fixed on the endless ribbon of steel. But she wasn't seeing the metal. She was seeing the motel receipt and the cold, empty look in Sean's eyes. The thunderous rhythm of the hydraulic press became a muffled, distant throb, and a film of unshed tears blurred her vision. A massive sheet of steel sped past her at 30 miles an hour, and she only noticed the defect at the very last second. A blister on the surface that looked like a bubbling sore. Her fingers hovered, paralyzed, over the emergency stop button. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She slammed the lever down, just as the flawed metal was about to disappear into the next section. But the damage was done. Cold sweat broke out under her mask, stinging her eyes as she realized how close she'd come to a catastrophic failure. The floor manager, a man whose skin had the color and texture of raw beef, materialized behind her like a bad omen. He slammed a heavy hand onto the safety railing, the vibration traveling up Tara's spine and making her jump. He jabbed a thick, grease-stained finger toward the rejected steel, leaning in until his face was inches from hers, his voice a harsh rasp that cut through the roar of the machinery. He spoke of the looming layoffs, reminding her that there were 100 people outside the gates who would kill for her spot. He told her that the next mistake wouldn't be a warning. It would be her final exit from the company. Tara stared at the floor, her jaw set, nodding as he berated her. She gripped the control levers so hard the cold metal seemed to burn her palms through the thick leather of her gloves. During the lunch break, the cafeteria smelled of rancid grease and burnt coffee. Tara stood frozen, her tray heavy in her hands, as she spotted Sean at a corner table. He was laughing, a loud, boisterous sound that she hadn't heard at home in years. He was surrounded by a group of 20-something guys from the repair crew, gesturing wildly as he told some story. Tara saw lightness in his movements, a predatory energy that felt alien to the man who sat in silence at her kitchen table. When Sean turned his head for a moment, his gaze swept over her without a hint of recognition, as if she were just another piece of factory equipment. Tara felt a cold realization settle in her gut. The man sitting there wasn't her husband. He was a stranger who had already moved on to a life that didn't include her. Tara lowered her head, the weight of her tray suddenly unbearable, and retreated into the shadows cast by the massive support columns. She reached into her pocket and felt the crumpled receipt, squeezing it until it was a tiny, hard pellet of paper. She pictured Jacob's pale face and the empty, echoing refrigerator waiting for her at home. She forced her facial muscles to go slack, smoothing out the lines of suspicion and rage until her face was a blank, unreadable mask. She decided then that she would become whatever she needed to be. A silent shadow, a dutiful wife, a woman who saw nothing. She would swallow the bitterness like a poison, returning to her station with the understanding that silence was the only currency she had left to keep their world from collapsing into the dirt. By the start of the next shift, Sean was already at the main distribution panel, his head thrown back as he flashed a bright, arrogant grin at anyone who looked his way. Tara hauled a heavy crate of tools past him, the handles digging into her palms. She could hear him intentionally raising his voice. his words cutting through the hum of the industrial fans. He was clapping a young welder on the shoulder, talking loudly about the ice-cold drafts at Joe's bar and detailing the long night of drinking he had planned. Tara felt him toss a sharp, mocking glance her way, but he looked away before she could catch his eye, continuing his performance of bachelor bravado. The constant thunder of the mill couldn't drown out his voice, and Tara felt her teeth grind together until her jaw ached. Suddenly, the overhead speakers erupted in a burst of static, followed by the monotone drone of a company announcement. A mandatory skills audit was beginning immediately. Tara watched the robotic arms on the assembly line freeze in mid-motion, and the bright arcs of the welders hissed into darkness. The air in the shop became heavy with a sudden, unnatural silence, broken only by the sound of labored breathing. Linda and Betty weren't laughing anymore. They were staring at the backs of their co-workers, their eyes narrowed as if they were already calculating who would be the first to go. Tara saw old Dick frantically scrubbing a piece of equipment that was already spotless, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal. Every look exchanged in that hallway was now poisoned with suspicion, a silent war of every man for himself. Sean's silhouette moved between the massive stamping presses, drawing Tara's eyes like a magnet despite her best efforts to look away. She watched him adjust his tool belt, her focus slipping from her own control panel for just a heartbeat. Beneath her boots, a thin, shimmering ribbon of oil began to snake across the floor, leaking from a ruptured cooling line. A white-hot ember tumbled from the overhead track, and the moment it touched the oil, the floor erupted in a whoosh of orange flame. Thick, acrid smoke billowed up, instantly obscuring her gauges. Tara screamed as the fire licked at the metal grating beneath her, the heat a sudden, violent blow to her face. She stumbled back, blinded by the flash, as the roar of the fire began to climb the machinery. The flames caught the heavy fabric of Tara's work pants at the thigh, the stench of singed wool filling her nose. Before she could react, a pair of powerful hands grabbed her by the collar and yanked her backward with enough force to send her sprawling onto the concrete. Old Dick dropped onto her, smothering the fire with a heavy sheet of treated canvas while the overhead sprinklers hissed to life. A deluge of cold chemical foam rained down, turning the floor into a treacherous white swamp. Tara lay there, her chest heaving, staring at her hands, which were now stained a deep, greasy gray. The roar of the water and the squelch of the foam drowned out the frantic thudding of her heart, while a cold, chemical mist began to curl around the silenced machines. The floor manager charged through the mist, waving his digital tablet like a weapon. His face was a deep, bruised purple, and the veins in his neck looked like taut wires. He pointed a trembling finger at the charred insulation and screamed at Tara, his spittle hitting her cheek. She watched as he tapped the screen with a brutal finality, dragging a red line through her name in the payroll ledger. Every word he shouted about negligence and fines felt like a hammer blow to her chest. She looked down at her foam-covered boots, realizing that the money she needed for the light bill and the water had just vanished into the smoke. The financial hole she was in had just become a grave. Back in the locker room, Betty slammed her locker door with a metallic bang that made everyone flinch. She turned to Tara, leaning back against the bench with a crooked, triumphant smile. She began to describe, in agonizing detail, the pink dress worn by a certain waitress at the roadside paradise, the one Sean spent every Wednesday night with. Tara stood frozen as Betty talked about how Sean would press the girl against the hood of his truck in the back lot of the diner. Betty savored every syllable, her eyes locked on Tara's pale face as the room filled with the smell of talcum and old sweat. Her voice became a high-pitched drill, boring into Tara's skull until the world began to tilt. Tara didn't think. She lunged. She caught Betty by her dyed hair and dragged her off the bench, the two of them hitting the floor with a heavy thud. They rolled across the grimy tile, knocking over benches and scattering the contents of work bags. Tara felt the sting of Betty's fingernails on her neck. But she didn't stop. She heard Betty's shrieks and the raw, guttural laughter of Linda watching from the sidelines. The other women formed a tight, expectant circle, shouting encouragements, but making no move to stop the violence. Tara swung her fist, the impact jarring her arm, but she felt no pain in her knuckles. Only the white-hot heat of a rage that had finally found an outlet. The rhythmic clanging of the lockers provided a metallic beat to the struggle, until the air was thick with dust and the smell of ozone. Tara pressed a cold hand to her swelling cheek as she climbed the steps to her porch. Hanging from the door handle, stark against the peeling white paint, was a bright yellow envelope. She ripped it open, and the words, "Notice of Foreclosure," seemed to vibrate on the page. The legal jargon blurred into a single, terrifying message. They had 72 hours before the sheriff arrived to put them on the street. A cold wind whipped the edges of the paper, whistling through the gaps in the porch railing. Tara looked at the cracks in the foundation and the weeds choking the yard, realizing that the only sanctuary she had ever known was being liquidated. The silence of the neighborhood felt heavy, like a shroud being pulled over the house. Sean was slumped in the armchair, his boots still caked with mill grime, thumbing lazily through the channels on the TV. Tara didn't say a word. She just threw the stack of past-due bills onto his lap, blocking his view of the screen. Sean didn't even look down at the papers. He looked right through her, his hand tightening on the remote until his knuckles turned white. When she started to speak about the mortgage, he vaulted out of the chair, sending the bills fluttering to the floor like dead leaves. He hissed that he didn't care about her junkie brother or the rotting shack they lived in. Tara looked into his eyes and saw a frozen wasteland where a heart used to be. A total absence of anything resembling a shared life. A muffled thud from the bathroom sent Tara sprinting across the hallway. She found Jacob collapsed on the tile, his body locked in a violent, arching convulsion. Thick, white foam bubbled at the corners of his mouth. Tara grabbed his shoulders, trying to keep him from cracking his skull against the tub, but his muscles were as rigid as iron bars. His eyes had rolled back, leaving only the terrifying veined whites visible, and his skin had turned the color of wet ash. She pressed her ear to his chest, catching a heartbeat that was nothing more than a faint, erratic flutter. She knew then that without a private clinic and real medicine, he wouldn't see the sun come up. The realization felt like a block of ice sliding down her throat. Tara ran into the bedroom and began to tear through Sean's travel bag with a frantic, desperate energy. She felt along the lining, her fingers catching on a stiff section near the bottom. She found a seam held together by crude, heavy stitches and ripped it open. Tucked inside was a thick bundle of $100 bills bound tightly with a rubber band. Her hands shook so hard she almost dropped the money. It was the escape fund Sean had been building. A pile of cash for a life that didn't include her or the house. The bills smelled of machine oil and cheap cologne. Tara clutched the money to her stomach, the weight of it representing the only chance Jacob had to live, and the only way to keep the bank from the door. She shoved the cash into the waistband of her jeans and stood before the mirror in the hallway. She wiped the smeared mascara from under her eyes and smoothed back the hair that had been torn loose in the fight with Betty. The woman staring back at her had dead eyes and a mouth set in a hard, straight line. She was looking at a stranger capable of a long, sustained lie. Tomorrow, she would put on her goggles and stand next to Sean at the mill. She would nod at his jokes and pretend she knew nothing, all while the bile rose in her throat. She would play the part of the loyal, oblivious wife until the moment was right. Tara squeezed her fists shut, using her hatred as a cold, steady fuel to get her through one more night in the Youngstown hell. The night shift began with a strange, emerald-colored smoke curling up from the lip of the main pouring ladle. The fumes weren't the usual gray or black. They were a sickly, neon green that turned the faces of the crew into something ghoulish. Tara could taste the copper on her tongue, a sharp, metallic tang that made her eyes water. The gas felt heavy, a physical weight that clung to her eyelashes and made every breath feel like she was inhaling powdered glass. The green mist swirled around the overhead cranes, thick enough to obscure the safety lights. High above, the automated sensors began to pulse a dull, rhythmic red, their warning chirps lost in the rising roar of the machinery. Sean stood with his back to the main control console, where the pressure needles were already vibrating deep in the red zone. He was leaning against the safety rail, laughing at some joke a mechanic had just told, his voice loud and performative. Tara watched a hairline crack bloom across the glass of a primary pressure gauge, but Sean didn't even flinch. He ignored the frantic, high-pitched whining coming from the steam lines, his fingers drumming a steady beat on the railing. He was playing the part of the cool, unbothered veteran, even as the equipment beneath his feet began to groan under the internal stress of a system about to fail. A sound like a thunderclap echoed through the shop as the steel teeth of the primary hoist sheared off. The massive ladle, holding tons of white-hot liquid steel, lurched violently and jammed at a 45-degree angle. It hung there, suspended directly over the work floor, the heavy chains groaning as they took the uneven weight. Tara saw sparks spray from the pulley blocks like a fireworks display. The vibration was so intense, it made the floor plates rattle against her boots, and a fine rain of rust and grit began to fall from the ceiling. The ladle swayed, sending out waves of heat that made the very air shimmer and warp, turning the world into a hall of mirrors. Tara lunged for the emergency release levers, her boots skidding on the metal grating. She grabbed the steel handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was cemented shut. She saw that a thick layer of cooled slag had splashed over the mechanism, hardening into a gray, stony crust that locked the gears in place. She threw her entire weight against the bar, the metal digging into her ribs, but the lock only gave a dull, metallic clunk. A jet of high-pressure steam hissed out from a cracked seal nearby, scorching the back of her hands through her gloves. But she didn't let go, desperate to break the blockage before the whole thing tipped. Sean's voice rose above the scream of the sirens, a jagged, panicked sound. He was pointing a grease-stained finger at Tara, his face a mottled purple. He screamed that she had sabotaged the line, that she had jammed the valves on purpose to get back at him for the motel and to ruin his standing with the bosses. Tara watched him back away toward the wall, his eyes darting around as he continued to shout accusations of sabotage. The sweat was pouring down his face, and he looked like a cornered animal, trying to pin the blame for the impending disaster on the woman he'd spent months betraying. Tara reached into her pocket and pulled out the crushed motel receipt. She stepped toward him and slapped the paper against his wet cheek, with enough force to make his head snap back. The paper stuck to his skin, the Roadside Paradise logo stark against his flushed face. Sean's eyes went wide as he realized what she was holding. The green steam swirled around them, turning his silhouette into a flickering ghost, while the receipt slowly peeled away and fluttered toward the floor. Tara didn't look away. She watched the realization of his own exposure sink in, even as the heat from the ladle began to singe the hair on her arms. Sean let out a guttural roar and grabbed Tara by the shoulders, shaking her with a violence that made her teeth rattle. He leaned in until his nose was touching hers, his breath smelling of stale coffee and fear. He screamed that the mill would be their grave if she didn't shut her mouth. He bared his teeth, shouting that he already had his way out, and he didn't give a damn about the house or the debt anymore. Tara felt his fingers bruising her skin through the heavy fabric of her robe. He was trying to shake the truth out of her. his hands trembling with a hatred that had finally been stripped of all its pretenses. A bolt the size of a fist snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and the upper support of the ladle gave way. Tara watched the first drop of liquid steel, a bead of light so bright it was blue, hit the floor 5 inches from her toes. It didn't just sit there. It ate through the steel grating like it was paper, leaving a glowing, molten hole. The smell of burning iron became a physical assault, and the sheer radiance of the spill began to blister the skin on Tara's cheeks. She stood frozen, watching a second globule hiss into the concrete, sending a spray of fire across her boots. Tara brought her forearms up and slammed them into Sean's chest, breaking his grip. She leaned in and screamed the truth over the roar of the dying machinery. She had his money. Every cent of his escape fund was gone. She watched the way his jaw dropped, his face going slack as the news hit him. She said it again, louder this time, making sure he understood that the life he'd planned for himself had just been confiscated. She looked into his empty, hollow eyes and felt a surge of cold triumph, even as the chains above them began to snap one by one, a rhythmic ticking toward the end. Sean's face twisted into a mask of pure, impotent malice. He looked around the floor like he expected to see the cash fluttering among the industrial waste. Around them, the plastic windows of the operator's booth began to sag and melt, dripping like black wax. The air was a thick, poisonous soup of burning rubber and ozone. Tara watched him struggle to breathe, the heat now so intense that the sweat on his skin was boiling. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw that he finally understood he was trapped in the very hell he'd helped build. The animal fear in Sean's eyes finally won out over his rage. He didn't say another word. He just turned and ran. He bolted toward the rear exit, leaping over piles of smoking cables and ignoring the screams of the other workers. He didn't look back even once when a section of the overhead gantry collapsed behind him, sending a cloud of soot and sparks into the air. Tara watched his retreating back until he disappeared into the green mist, leaving her alone on the vibrating platform as the roar of the escaping steel reached a deafening, final crescendo. Tara stood perfectly still as the circle of fire closed in around her. She watched the massive steel beams of the roof begin to warp and groan under the heat. The wind created by the firestorm whipped her hair across her face, and the light from the molten spill danced in her eyes. The sound of the collapsing mill became a rhythmic, beautiful chaos to her ears. She looked at her hands, empty of everything she'd once valued, and realized that her old life had already been reduced to ash. She took a deep breath of the scorched air, feeling a strange, hollow lightness as the last chain holding the ladle snapped with a final, echoing crack. Tara lunged toward the red emergency cabinet, the glass already spiderwebbing from the blistering heat. She grabbed the heavy fire axe, the cold steel of the handle a shock against her palms. With a guttural cry, she swung the blade against the jammed iron bar of the exit. Sparks showered her face as the axe bit into the metal. She swung again, her shoulders screaming with the effort, until the iron bolt finally sheared off and the heavy door flew open. A rush of cooler, though still smoke-choked air hit her, and she stepped through the threshold just as the ceiling behind her began to buckle. She moved through the gray haze of the yard, her face covered with a wet rag. Overhead, sheets of roofing tin were being ripped away by the heat, falling like giant razors. One slammed into the concrete inches from her heels, vibrating with a low, metallic hum. Tara wove between pools of burning oil and twisted wreckage, her eyes fixed on the dim, flickering safety lights of the outer gate. Scalding grit blew into her collar, but she didn't slow down. She threw her weight against the final gate, bursting out onto the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, just as a massive explosion rocked the ground behind her. Tara ran toward the far end of the lot, where the blue paint on Sean's pickup was already blistering under the raining soot. She grabbed a jagged chunk of slag from the ground and smashed the driver's side window. Glass rained into the cabin like diamonds. She reached inside, ignoring the shards that sliced into her arm, and tore open the glove box. Her fingers scrambled through old receipts and maps until they closed around a heavy ring of keys and the leather folder containing the truck's registration. She gripped them tight, her own blood slicking the plastic as she prepared to take the only thing he had left. The air was filled with the scream of sirens as the first fire trucks roared onto the scene, their lights painting the smoke in flashes of red and blue. Tara saw Sean standing near the police line, his arms waving frantically as he spoke to an officer. He was doing his best to look like a broken man, pointing back at the burning mill and shouting about a sudden equipment failure. Tara watched him wipe his brow and stumble, a practiced display of shock designed to hide his own negligence. The cop was scribbling it all down, oblivious to the woman watching from the shadows of the parking lot. Tara walked straight to the truck, her gaze locked ahead. Sean spotted her, and the words died in his throat. His face went white, then a dark, bruised red. He lunged toward her, trying to block the door, screaming for his keys and his share of the money. His voice hit a high, shrill note that made a few nearby workers turn their heads. Tara didn't answer. She climbed into the cab, slammed the door, and locked it. She shoved the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life, a deep, mechanical growl that drowned out Sean's curses as he hammered his fists against the hood. She didn't stop until she reached the house, the front door still standing open from her frantic mourning. The living room smelled of sickness and old sweat. Jacob was sitting on the edge of the couch, his hands white-knuckled as he gripped the cushions. His eyes were bloodshot and unfocused, but he knew her. Tara grabbed a duffel bag and began throwing in whatever she could reach: sweaters, jeans, the remaining bottles from the medicine cabinet. She hauled Jacob to his feet, her arm around his waist as he stumbled. She didn't give him time to speak, dragging him toward the door as the sounds of the distant sirens grew louder. Tara paused at the kitchen table for one final second. The foreclosure notice was still there, mocking her. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the heavy brass house keys, and slammed them down on the wood. They landed right on the bank's red seal with a sharp, final clatter. She looked at the water stain on the ceiling and the peeling wallpaper, seeing them for what they were, symbols of a life she was finished with. She turned her back on the room and walked out, leaving the door wide open to the wind and the coming rain. She shoved Jacob into the passenger seat of the truck and slammed the door shut. As she hit the gas, the tires screamed against the gravel, kicking up a cloud of dust. In the rearview mirror, a massive pillar of black smoke was rising over Youngstown, a dark monument to the city's slow death. The mill was a glowing orange wound on the horizon, the flames licking at the low-hanging clouds. Jacob pressed his forehead against the glass, watching the silhouettes of the smokestacks vanish into the dark. Tara gripped the wheel, the smell of smoke still clinging to her skin, and didn't look back. The truck pulled up to a rusted pump at a gas station on the state line. Tara stepped out into the cool night air, the silence of the countryside a shock after the roar of the mill. She counted out a few crisp bills from Sean's stash and handed them to a bored teenager behind a bulletproof window. Back in the cab, she took out her phone. She popped the back off, snapped the SIM card in half, and tossed it into a trash can filled with greasy wrappers. She was a ghost now. She stood by the pump, listening to the rhythmic thud of the fuel entering the tank, the only sound in the dark. The tires hummed against the concrete seams of the highway as they headed north. Tara watched the mirror as the last glow of the Youngstown fires finally dipped below the horizon. The city was gone, dissolved into the gray mist of a pre-dawn morning. She felt the iron bands of tension in her shoulders finally begin to loosen, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. Road signs flashed by in the headlights, names of towns she'd never been to, places where she could be anyone. She shifted gears, feeling the miles pile up between her and the ruins of her life, turning the past into a fading memory. Tara rolled the window down all the way, letting the cold, fast air blast into the cabin. She took a long, deep breath, feeling the last traces of sulfur and coal dust leave her lungs. The air out here smelled of pine needles and wet pavement. She leaned her head back, letting the wind whip her hair and sting the cuts on her arms. The roar of the furnaces was finally gone, replaced by the steady rush of the wind and the tires. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, savoring a silence that didn't feel like a threat, but like a beginning. She looked over at Jacob, who had finally fallen into a deep, quiet sleep. His breathing was steady, and the gray, sickly tint had left his skin. Tara reached out and rested a hand on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his body through his jacket. A small, jagged smile touched the corners of her mouth, the first one in years. She knew the road ahead would be hard, filled with cheap rooms and the fear of the unknown. But it didn't matter. The old world had burned to the ground, and she was finally driving away from the fire.